Richard Sharp has resigned as chair at the BBC.
It follows an investigation into his part in facilitating an £800,000 loan guarantee to the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson.
He didn't tell us that he'd facilitated an £800,000 loan for the Prime Minister, who then gave him the job. It's all about Banana Republic.
The chairman of the BBC, Richard Sharp, resigned last week for failing to declare how he'd helped Boris Johnson to get a $1 million loan guarantee. Now, Boris Johnson, who was PM at the time, subsequently appointed Sharp to that top BBC job. And so, to some, the whole thing smells very fishy. And on top of all that, one British newspaper is being accused of being anti-Semitic for portraying Mr. Sharp, who is Jewish, as some kind of puppet master. Now, we're going to be talking more about that a little later in the programme. But first, let's look at who's who in this particularly sticky little web.
I have, therefore, this morning, resigned as the BBC chair to the Secretary of State and to the board.
At the centre of the web is Richard Sharp, a former investment banker with more connections than King's Cross train station. In his web are not one, but two prime ministers. The current one, Rishi Sunak, worked under him at Goldman Sachs between 2001 and 2004. And he's known Boris Johnson for a similar amount of time, something like 20 years. Now, Sharp's critics say he only got his job as BBC chairman thanks to helping out the blonde bombshell PM, who was reportedly broke at the time.
Absolutely not. Let me just tell you, Richard Sharp is a good and a wise man, but he knows absolutely nothing about my personal finances. I can tell you that for 100% ding-dang sure.
Boris Johnson certainly has a way with words, but do you believe him? Here's what actually happened, catalogued in the official report. October 2020, Sharp tells the PM he's going to apply for the job at the BBC. The following month, he formally makes the application. The next month, Sharp approaches the PM's top civil servant, Simon Case, to let him know that he can introduce the PM to a very rich Canadian, Sam Blythe, who can assist the PM with his finances. Barely a week later, Sharp is interviewed by a panel for the job at the BBC.
I was subject to a very rigorous interview process. I needed to be considered appointable, if you like, and recommendable.
And then the following month, January 2021, Sharp is given the good news. He's formally appointed as chairman of the BBC, a role that is ultimately decided by guess who? That's right, the PM. But since he got the job, everything was going great for the new chairman, except for every single day when people were complaining that he was not impartial because he was a big donor to the governing Tory party. Something like $500,000 since 2001.
Clearly he broke the rules. We knew he was a big Tory party donor. We knew he'd given £400,000 to the Tories.
That's not against the rules.
Which is, I was going to say, that's not against the rules, and we knew about that. I think it's wrong. I don't think you should be giving huge amounts of money and then getting a plum job for the people you've given money to. I think that's wrong.
Now, did being a Tory donor affect his judgment as chairman of the BBC? It's hard to say, but what we do know is that the BBC under Sharp suspended its top football presenter, Gary Lineker, for tweeting against the government's immigration policies.
The BBC does not want, it's uncomfortable with their highest paid star actually discussing and getting involved in a controversial policy, whichever side it was.
Now, the Lineker affair put Sharp in the spotlight, but it was the Sunday Times report in January this year that really did for him. The newspaper was the first to reveal Sharp's role in securing the loan for Boris Johnson.
That's disgusting, and it's been going on under your nose in plain sight.
The opposition Labour Party called for an inquiry, and despite insisting that Sharp got his job on merit, the government agreed to one. Barrister Adam Heppenstall led the inquiry and published his report on April the 28th, concluding that Sharp should have mentioned to the panel that he told PM Johnson that he wanted the job, and he should have mentioned how he'd offered to arrange a meeting with the millionaire Sam Blythe. Sharp resigned the same day.
I wish, with the benefit of hindsight, this potential perceived conflict of interest was something I'd considered to mention.
I don't think he's understood the severity and the seriousness of this situation.
This was my error.
Time to bring in our guest now, and we're joined by the Conservative political commentator Andre Walker, and we also have Roger Casale, the former Labour MP and founding chair of the BBC All-Party Parliamentary Group. Andre, let me start with you. First of all, a lot of outrage about this story, and on the face of it, it really smells bad. Is that faux outrage, or is there something really wrong here?
Well, there is certainly something incredibly wrong here. When Gary Lineker, the sports presenter, started tweeting out his support for the left and for socialism, I knew that the end result of it would be that he would not be sacked. Instead, the Conservative appointed chairman of the BBC would be sacked instead. After all, the BBC is an institution of the political left. But that's, all, in a sense, not the problem that we see here. The real problem is, in 1997, when Tony Blair came in, he promised a stakeholder society. Now, what that means is that rather than we exercise a genuine democracy, we pass powers to consultations of big vested interests, and we have far more executive institutions and quangos. Those executive institutions are all Labour apparatchiks, and in reality what it means is whichever way you vote at the ballot box in Britain, nothing changes. Now, what we've seen with the BBC, and what's really interesting for an international audience, is that now there are calls right across Britain to no longer allow the Prime Minister or the Secretary of State for Culture to appoint this person. Instead, they should be appointed by the same appointments process, which guarantees that every executive agency in the UK is run by somebody from the centre-left. And so once again, that idea that that little bit of accountability that the BBC had by being appointed by a democratically elected government, that is the thing that these people are so desperate to be rid of, because then, of course, it means the BBC can continue to operate like the Environment Agency and all the other executive agencies run by the political left, whether people vote for them or not.
Well, that's an extremely interesting interpretation of the story. Roger, he's turned it all on its head and blamed Gary Lineker, essentially, and poor old Richard Sharp as a scapegoat.
Well, I think Gary Lineker was last week's story. This week's story is Richard Sharp, but maybe the two are connected. It's a bit lost on me. I mean, Andre's told us that in his view, the BBC is kind of left-wing conspiracy. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people who believe that it's a right-wing conspiracy. What I'd like to say is I don't think it's a conspiracy at all. And I don't think the public wants it to be a conspiracy. I think what we want is a BBC that is above politics, that is independent of party, and that the public can trust.
We'll talk about the appointment process in a moment, but just about Richard Sharp. Perhaps he didn't actually do anything wrong, but the problem is that he didn't declare it to the panel interviewing him. Is that the issue, Roger?
Well, yes, it is. That is partly the issue. That's the sort of the technical issue that he called him out. And you know, these things can happen. I mean, I've got nothing against Richard Sharp. People can make a mistake. He said he was trying to do the right thing. It doesn't seem to me that he was the right person in the first place. I mean, what you want is you don't want the public to think that the chairman of the BBC is somebody who is a mate of the prime minister's and providing a loan. I mean, the issue was, remember, not that exactly what he'd done, but whether it was accountable, it was transparent, and so on. I think that this is, this goes far broader than just the technical issues that caught him out. Why did he think that he was the kind of person? Why didn't Ned put his name forward in the first place? He's a Conservative Party donor. And, he's somebody who's making, as it turns out, trying to arrange a loan helping to arrange a loan for the Prime Minister. And that's not helpful to the BBC. The BBC needs people in leadership positions who are going to...
Roger, you say that, Roger, but didn't Labour do the same thing under Tony Blair with Gavin Davies in 2001? And wasn't he a donor to the Labour Party? And also a member of the Labour Party and also former Goldman Sachs?
Yes, I'm not, as I said clearly before, I'm not picking a fight with Richard Sharp. I'm just saying this is not the right way to go about things. It wasn't right then, and it's not right now.
Come in, Andre.
Yeah, so the reality is, if you look at publicappointments.gov.uk, where they make all the appointments to all of these executive agencies, what they do is they constantly encourage diversity choices. So they'll say things like, we're looking for applications from black people, from disabled people, from people who have interests in charities. And the net result of it is the sort of people who think in that mindset are the sorts of people who are typically on the political left. And so the reality is that if you look at, say, the Environment Agency run by Chris Smith, Many of your viewers won't know who he was, but, you know, he's one of the biggest townies you'll ever meet. He's a former MP for Islington and Labour Secretary of State. Most of these executive agencies are run by people who are on the political left. Every now and again, a Conservative gets through almost accidentally. And, of course, the whole of the United Kingdom crows about it. The reality is, we need to stop these executive agencies wielding the power that they wield. I personally would abolish the BBC, but certainly if we don't abolish the BBC, let's elect the BBC board on at the same time as the general election. I'll tell you why I say that. Because everybody who's angry about Richard Sharp being chairman doesn't want more accountability in the process of selecting the BBC chairman. They want less. They want to hand it from a democratically elected government to a backroom deal amongst the usual public appointment left-wingers. Sad, really.
Roger, do you think that his relationship, Sharp's relationship with Johnson, meant that he would in any way be beholden to the Tory party and it might affect his editorial judgment? For example, you know, sacking Lineker when he put out those anti-government tweets.
Well, let's remember that the board of BBC, it's not just a government's role, it also has a managerial role. And apparently Richard Sharp used to like going into the studios after his favourite programmes to meet people, a bit like the chairman of British Airways popping in to see the pilots during a flight. I mean, I think he was far too close to it. The point is that Prime Minister's going to want to appoint somebody that they can trust. But what we need in the chair of the BBC is somebody that the public can trust. And one thing that one could say about Richard Sharp, and I'm not defending his actions in any way at all, but I simply point out to those who only want to talk about what he did wrong, that he was actually somebody who was an advocate for the BBC. And again, as we just heard from Andrew Walker, who wants to abolish the BBC. There are a lot of Conservative MPs who agree with Andre, and I think that you know, we could be going from the frying pan into the fire if we get somebody appointed now who wants to do what Andre has just told us he wants to do, which is to abolish the BBC.
Come on, Andre.
I mean, if we, as a middle ground, what I would like to do at the BBC as BBC chairman, and certainly what I would do as Prime Minister, is appoint the most fire-breathing, Conservative-hating, Brexit-opposing, snooty, snobby, obnoxious Labour Party supporter, your Alistair Campbells, your Lord Adonises, you know, maybe Lineker himself as chairman. Let's expose the BBC for what it really is. You know, the stupidity of appointing Richard Sharp is that you get somebody to shine up the creatures that lurk at the BBC, and I personally wouldn't do it. Look, I think the reality is the BBC's past its sell-by date. Young people don't watch it. It's publicly funded. It has the second largest streaming service in the UK next to Channel 4, which is also a public service broadcaster, but run in an entirely different fashion. It's this honking old left-wing beast. I honestly believe we should let it die. But in the meantime, let's give John Bercow the job of BBC chairman. Give them somebody they really want.
Roger, just finally, I mean, looking ahead, people have said to, or asked Rishi Sunak if they should, stop the BBC chairman role being a political appointee kind of role, and he would not answer it. He kept saying, I'm in Scotland now, and I want to talk about Scotland.
But should the next person not be a non-political appointment?
As I said, right now I'm focused on talking to people here in Scotland about what we're doing to deliver for them. Most of all, the cost of living.
That's not the answer to my question, Prime Minister. Well, should the next person be a non-political appointment?
We're jumping ahead of it. There's an established appointments process for all these things, and it will be right that we turn to that when the time is right. But right now I'm here talking to the people in Scotland about what we're doing to deliver for them.
Do you think it should be brought to an end now, it being a political appointment?
Yes, I do. I think it should be completely independent. And I think, although I don't want to spend my time on your show attacking Conservatives past or present, maybe what Andre wants to do, and I don't agree with Andre, I do think that Andre's, the points that Andrew's making, the debate that Andre wants to have, is the debate that we need to have. And thank you for the opportunity to have it on your programme. I think that needs to go wider. I think the public needs to get much more involved. We need to think about who is the BBC for, what is it for, and how is it accountable to the public?
Roger Casali and Andre Walker, thanks so much for your contributions today. Much appreciated. Now, on top of this controversial story is the controversial coverage of it in the press. In particular, this cartoon published in the Guardian newspaper after he resigned. Many people have condemned it as anti-Semitic for depicting Richard Sharp, who is Jewish, in a stereotypical way. The Jewish author, Dave Rich, tweeted, "It falls squarely into an anti-Semitic tradition of depicting Jews with outsized, grotesque features, often in conjunction with money and power." After the backlash, the Guardian newspaper deleted the cartoon, admitting it did not meet our editorial standards. Also apologising, the cartoonist, Mr. Martin Rowson, said that through carelessness and thoughtlessness, I screwed up pretty badly. OK, let's bring in our second panel now. And Tim Wilson is an award-winning animator and art collector. And we also have Mark Fox, who is the president of the West London Synagogue. Thank you so much, both of you. Tim, can I start with you? You've looked at the cartoon, as we all have, and you find it very problematic for many different reasons. Can you take us through it?
Well, yes, I think and it certainly shows anti-Semitic tropes. And I think the chief one that I notice is the presence of the pig. It's not just the head of a pig, it's a whole pig. Now, of course, we know that David Cameron had an association with a pig, but within this context, that pig clearly has some sort of anti-Semitic resonance. It's not the same pig that David Cameron encountered. And what I would like to do is to draw a parallel between this cartoon and a cartoon which appeared in America about 4 years ago by a man called Garrison. And if you look at this one, this is so much more alarming than the one by Garrison, and the Garrison cartoon was deeply condemned as anti-Semitic. That was a cartoon which had a sort of green hand owned by Rothschilds that was controlling a puppet, a Soros puppet, that was in turn controlling other puppets. And it's the puppetry, it's the filth, it's the pig, it's the squid, it's the box. So when Richard Sharp was lost his job, was sacked or whatever, yes, he might be leaving his office with a box, but it would be a box marked with BBC, not Goldman Sachs. So automatically, it's questionable. And I think if the cartoonist, if Martin Rowson wanted to give the impression that Richard Sharp was enmired in the filth of the Johnson regime and in money, that is one joke he could have put across. But the way it's put across, it's drawing on anti-Semitic stereotypes. I think it's deeply offensive.
Mark Fox, you also say that there are just too many symbols within this cartoon, and we can see it on our screens now, to have been accidental. Can you just take us through, as Tim has done, your observations of each symbol and what you think it might refer to?
Absolutely. I mean, the facial features, Tim is a cartoonist, I'm not, but fair enough, they're a little bit exaggerated, but that doesn't worry me. What worries me is, why is there an apparently random squid in a basket? A squid isn't exactly the sort of item we normally carry around. The answer is that the squid was used very, very heavily by the Nazis and a lot of Nazi propaganda to accuse the Jews of having tentacles around the world. And there are lots and lots of cartoons. You can look online in 1 minute of that specific anti-Semitic trope. The pig, Tim's already mentioned. What worried me not just about the pig, but the fact is what it's spewing out. It could have just had gold coins coming out, maybe some banknotes. But look carefully, just by the mouth, it actually has blood coming out as well. That appears to be a reference to an ancient medieval anti-Semitic trope when the Jews were accused of killing Christian babies and using their blood in certain particular foods that the Jews ate. So there are a number of apparently random objects in this, too many of them to be random. So there's just a series of different images there that, you know, could one have accidentally got through? Maybe. It seems, you know, to misquote Lady Bracknell in The Importance of Being Earnest, by the time you're up to 4 tropes, you really are a long way beyond carelessness. And seem to be very firmly in the land of deliberate intent.
Just to be clear, Martin Rowson, the cartoonist, has apologised, saying he was in a mad rush to cram as much in as possible in the 5 or so hours available. His Jewishness, meaning Richard Sharp, never crossed my mind as I twisted his features according to the standard cartooning playbook. You mentioned you don't really have a problem with the features. After all, Boris Johnson is also severely grotesquely caricatured as well. But he goes on to talk about the symbolism, which he says is not actually there, it's just coincidental. He goes on to say the cute squid and little Rishi were no more than that, a cartoon squid and short Prime Minister. It never occurred to me that some might see them as puppets of Sharp. What do you think, Mark?
Well, maybe one, perhaps carelessness. Maybe two, and I'm trying to be generous here, maybe two, it is really coincidence. But 4 different issues, all in the same cartoon, frankly, that beggars belief.
Tim,
it
just
just doesn't stack up.
Tim, if you were doing the cartoon yourself, how would you have done it? 4, 5, 6 hours, how would you have done the cartoon?
I would have focused on Boris Johnson. If I wanted the same joke, I would have focused on Boris to start with. And
I'm wondering why, really, because it was Richard Sharp who approached Boris Johnson about the possibility of getting him a loan guarantee, wasn't it?
It was indeed. It was indeed, and we don't know whether that loan even happened. So the whole thing is shrouded in a certain amount of mystery, in chaos. It's like talking to your accountant. After a while, your eyes glaze over, and you don't know whether you're coming or you're going. The amount of financial problems that Boris seems to have presided over himself personally in his own domestic life is staggering, and everything he seems to have touched seems to have gone wrong. So from that point of view, I think it's a very good joke here. Maybe I would have put Rishi on top of that heap with Boris, but I don't think. I don't understand what the squid represents. If it doesn't represent the tentacles of, if it doesn't represent some sort of anti-Semitic tentacles, I don't know what it does represent.
Tim, you've pointed out elsewhere that The Guardian has a bit of form with these sorts of offensive cartoons, and you mentioned something to do with Priti Patel. You want to just take us through that cartoon?
Oh my goodness, yes, absolutely. Well, this is a cartoon of Priti Patel as a bull with a ring on her nose. Now, I'm not a fan of Priti Patel at all. I think she started a lot of the problems that Suella Braverman has continued in the Home Office. But once again, this is a choosing to represent somebody as a bull. It's so fundamentally racist. And to pick up what Mark was saying. He talked about it, whether this was accidental. I don't think the word accident is the issue. I think it's about being casual. And casual racism or unintentional racism is the issue. And if we go back even further, because again, I would suggest that the anti-Semitic cartoons that we see in magazines like The Stürmer they're already there before that. They're already there in the 19th century, the Berliner Wespen and bits and pieces. So all of this visual imagery gears up to create the anti-Semitic environment that gives us the Holocaust. And in the same way, if we are not sensitive to the needs of others and to the sensibilities of others, then actually we are drumming up a popular hatred at a very subliminal level. Pictures talk more loudly than words. Pictures go in at a much deeper level. And if we are going to use racist stereotypes to get our humor, and then we're going to say, oh well, it's just a joke. I mean, it happened to me. I got involved in a story with Humza Yousaf up in Scotland, and a UKIP MEP made a very racist joke. I took exception to it, and Nigel Farage wouldn't apologise. He said, "Well, it's just a joke." It may have just been a joke, but that was the problem. It's casual racism, and that must be fought against. We must fight against that.
Yes, let's talk about racism then, because Mark, a Labour politician, Diane Abbott, said recently that Jewish people can't really experience racism in Britain. They experience prejudice, but not racism, because essentially they're the same as the majority of the white British population. What do you make of that?
The interesting thing is that David Baddiel, the famous comedian, wrote a book not very long ago called Jews Don't Count. And his argument is because Jews are tend to look whitish, shall we say. Some of them have Turkish blood in, as I do, for example, actually have Turkish blood and other things, but they basically tend to look whitish. Therefore, everyone assumes they can't be a victim of racism in the way that someone from Africa or the Caribbean or India or whatever might be. And of course, that's absolute nonsense. All racism is a characterization of hating or disliking people on account of their attributed race, rather than who or what they are as individuals or what it is they've achieved or not achieved in their lives. So it's absolute nonsense to suggest that Jews cannot be victims of racism. Any group, if it's characterized, or bunch of people, if they're characterized by their cultural origins, not just the color of their skin or whatever, can be victims of racism.
Mark Fox and Tim Wilson, thank you so much for your contributions to the Nexus today. Much appreciated. And thank you at home and on your phones for watching. If you want to see this episode or any of our previous episodes, do go to our channel on YouTube. Just type in Nexus TRT World. Till next week then, goodbye.